Myron Swiston here, and I want to continue today with Automatises, uh, the Regina 5, and New York as well. There's a lot of difficulty for the artist, the creative artist, visual artist, a lot of uncertainty, and of course, the angst of the 20th century, from epitomized in Edvard Munch painting the cry, the scream, over not only the artists but the entire population, of course, of the world. In many events, as I mentioned in previous videos, bring about this uncertainty, but artists are looking for certainty and looking for change. They are attempting to be free, have their creative process to be unenculturated. And so abstract art is, in the 20th century, a very significant art movement for both North America and Europe as well. Clement Greenberg ratified and visited Canadian artists, Painters 11 and out west, Regina 5, and ratified Canadian painting and showed the painters that they were doing good work and world-class work. Of course, Clement Greenberg he put his money into Canadian painters. William Ronald, Jack Bush, and William Paraduff on the prairies. So he was really enjoying the Canadian painting and the wild, perhaps, or the bite, and some of the uncertainty, of course, that artists face. William Paraduff was influenced by Barnett Newman, of course, and he was outside of the Regina 5 group on the prairies and stayed in his own style of open skies, large color field paintings, of course geometric blocks of color, but color field mostly. And of course he must have understood Mark Rothko's work in large planes of tonality of color. And so that came the influence to William Paraduff. Extended out, of course, into more recent times, Ivan Erie, prairie painter working out of Winnipeg, of course, invented again the Canadian landscape and more. His pictorial anatomy, of course, is much more representational. But you can see that this broad openness, the sky, and of course I mentioned Otto Rogers earlier as painting on the prairies. And this openness, the flatness, is indicative of the time there on the prairies. The Regina 5 got known across Canada through the National Gallery circulating show in the 50s, of course, and went coast to coast showing their work. Otherwise, they would have been fairly remote and to the Canadian art scene. Major group in Canadian painting, middle 40s, started by Paul Emile Bourdas, called the Automatises. They were a group of 12 artists, and Paul Emile Bourdas, of course, was in Paris, early 28 and 30, influenced by Miro, Surrealists, Dali, André Breton, and the ideas inherent in Surrealist ideas. He did come back to Canada, of course, and visited New York where he saw, of course, the abstract American painters. It was a short hop, of course, for Bourdas to New York to see. Of course, the work of Franz Klein influenced Bourdas while he was in New York. He did stay in the 50s, 53, 55. He lived in New York. And he had a show at the Martha Jackson Gallery in New York. So he was well respected at the time. Then he returns back, of course, to Paris later in the 50s and stayed in middle 50s to 60 and dies in Paris. One of his students was part of the Automatises group, Jean-Paul Riopelle, and they both, of course, visited New York and were thought of quite highly because Riopelle, of course, had a show, a Pierre Matisse gallery, of course, and he started success quite early on in his career. Frank O'Hara liked his work in New York, art critic. In the 40s, after the Second World War, of course, he goes to Paris. He meets Joan Mitchell in Paris, American abstract painter. And they had a very tumultuous 25-year relationship there. Of course, Sam Francis was there, and I think Sam Francis, abstract painter from New York, influenced Joan Mitchell's work and her color field, abstraction, lyrical, of course. You could maybe say some botanical flower references, but very bright, bright colors, not unlike what Sam Francis was doing at the time. Jean-Paul Riopelle, of course, had a chance, of course, to see Monet's work, Claude Monet's work, and his gestural forms. Although it was the lily ponds, Monet worked to the edges, the tops, and the bottoms. And you can see the direct influence in Jean-Paul Riopelle's work. Lyrical abstraction, you can see the direct connection to Monet. Of course, Jean-Paul Riopelle used the oil, thick palette knife. He worked the overall composition of his paintings. He was being quite well known and sold work, had an international status already in Paris from his work, the quality of the work, the consistency of the work at the time. The work, of course, later work, Riopelle's work and Bourdas' work in Paris represent kind of very similar in the sense that they both use the palette knife in oil paint, in blocks of color. But Bourdas' direct influence, of course, was really Franz Klein with the black, white gestures, of course, flat modulated areas of color, a lot of white and black used. There was this, of course, animosity, I think, that was generated between Jean-Paul Riopelle and Bourdas because Bourdas was watching, of course, Riopelle's career take off and his paintings being sold, and Bourdas was left somewhat behind, of course. Just to jump back, in Montreal, Canada, the Automatises originated by Paul Emile Bourdas, of course, and his Rufus Global, global refusal, his separation of church and state, and he was then turfed out of his teaching position in the 40s in Montreal, of course. And after that, he goes back and forth to New York, and of course, eventually ends up in Paris. Bourdas never really got to the exposure level that Jean-Paul Riopelle achieved. The Automatises Bourdas exhibited, shown across Canada through the National Gallery, of course, and brought coast to coast the awareness of the Automatises as a group, solid group of painters, abstract painters. And that brought the light to bear upon what they were actually doing there. The influence, of course, from San Francis was Joan Mitchell. Influence to Bourdas was from Franz Klein, of course. Later on, Riopelle's reputation was already established as a world-class artist. The late 80s, he comes back to Canada to paint the goose, Canada goose, and ducks and wildlife themes, never really returning to his lyrical abstraction color field, influenced and related to Claude Monet, of course. So Bourdas, of course, I think with his involvement in this politics in Quebec, Canada, really perhaps diverted some of his attention from his painting in being involved in the political ideologies of the time during the Second World War and immediately after the Second World War. The Painters 11, of course, was formed in the middle 50s, and 10 years earlier the Automatises were formed already in painting abstractly in New York. I don't see any direct connection with these painters as group to group, but their association, of course, with the New York painters, abstract painters in New York. Of course, Jackson Pollock must have also seen Monet's paintings, the filling of the space from here and here, of course, which influenced Riopelle in his action painting, from Jackson Pollock's action painting, of course, and the overall lyrical color field paintings. Of course, in his trips, Bourdas' trips and Riopelle's trips to New York, many times feet on the ground, and this is prior to all of the modern computers and internet, of course, so artists had to really go and look and see what was really going on in New York. They had to visit the shows and talk to the artists and see what was going on at that time. The Riopelle, of course, the figurative and cubist plane and line in this way, I think Riopelle really didn't embrace cubist or Modigliani or Miro. He really stayed in his idea, connected, I think, to Claude Monet and homage to Claude Monet. The Painters 11, of course, were mostly in interconnection back and forth to New York, whereas the two Automatises painters really got this influence from Paris and the Parisian art scene, especially realizing that Paris was not destroyed during the war, Second World War, and immediately after the war, of course, it became the world center, the foment of all these artists. Now materials were becoming available in Paris at that time. So the hunger that was there, and so the direct influence, European influence to Riopelle and Bourdas was, I think, closer than the abstract expressionist Painters 11 in in central Canada. Now, Jack Bush, of course, followed the color field, large color field abstraction, Barnett Newman, of course, and Franz Klein with the overall gesture of his work. Jack Bush, of course, had three important students and painters of the next generation. Alex Cameron, Canadian painter, Toronto. David Balduc, Canadian painter, of course. And Paul Fournier, Canadian painters, all drew influence from Jack Bush. Jack Bush was also directly influenced, of course, by Henri Matisse in his color work, his color field work in terms of arbitrary color, harmonious color, which really came from Matisse's visits to North Africa, Morocco, with the light and the colors, atmospheric colors. And so Jack Bush really adapted quite readily these atmospheric colors and ethereal colors, spiritual colors, directly from Matisse, Henri Matisse. And so there is a strong connection there, Jack Bush with Matisse, and coming back to Franz Klein directly. William Ronald, of course, embraced abstraction in New York with his show at the Coots Gallery. Really put him, and he stayed in New York for quite some time. Got the stamp, of course, from his show. Clement Greenberg endorsed William Ronald, so really gave him a status that he wouldn't have achieved staying just in Canada. So artists today or in the past had to reach out outside of Canada to become world-class artists because of the size perhaps of the country and a small population in the country, the enculturation of the society to a group of seven. There were a lot of factors that really kept Canada isolated, except for the Automatises bridging out to Europe, and the Parisian art scene coming from the 40s, early 50s, and depositing itself in New York, of course. The difficulties that these artists had to get their work because of this abstract language was huge. And as we know in the historical context, the difficulty with substances and abuse of substances and drinking, alcoholism, and the brutality of their experience in the society in which they lived. Of course, they were really voices, Automatises and Painters 11 were really voices in the wilderness. And of course, the National Gallery in Canada circulating the Automatise group and the Painters 11 group and the Regina 5 group really disseminated across Canada, coast to coast, in rural areas as well, this whole idea of abstraction, and brought it into Canadian painting today. I think today still there's a very difficult time for people to understand and comprehend this entire language of abstraction. So it's difficult even today for artists that they're doing abstraction, modern art. It is very difficult to break the way through the enculturating process. It's difficult because society wants you to paint in a certain way. They want you to behave and conduct in understandable forms. And these were really the wild beasts of the society in what they were doing, both in Europe, New York, of course, and in Ontario. Achille Gorky, really significant because if influence from Miro into New York, and really some influence to the Painters 11, but the Painters 11 really totally didn't embrace Gorky. Who they really embraced was the gestural part of abstraction, the lyrical part of abstraction, the painterly abstraction that they endorsed, and took on these kinds of issues, painterly issues, and tried to find their way with these issues, which are difficult because of the lack of perhaps some modern criticism. Robert Fulford, of course, during all this time of Canadian abstract, Painters 11, Automatises, Giant 5, supported these painters, and I don't know to what degree the flack that Robert Fulford sustained because of his support of Canadian painting here. Just to come back to Harold Town, of course, he wanted to, of course, keep his, I think, his Canadian identity, and maybe he missed the boat a little bit by allowing Clement Greenberg to visit his studio. But history will show that, of course, and he was so successful that at that time, with sellout shows, that Clement Greenberg, I don't know if it would have helped Harold Town all that much. But this influence, of course, abstract from New York is important. Today it's an ongoing thing. I'd like to talk further on Cy Twombly, New York painter who left New York, he left this abstract movement and went to Italy to paint for his entire career. Significant modern painting influence. And so I'm going to talk about a little bit about Cy Twombly and his influence in painting, Canadian painting. I'm going to return to the Automatises, the other members. The 12 members in Automatises, 11 painters, 11. So there's 23, 24 painters who are major painters in Canadian painting. I'm going to return to Painters 11 and the Automatises and their support of each other and the National Gallery support of these artists. I thank you again. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now.